Has protein evolution been all figured out? Is getting proteins to evolve by natural processes really no problem for evolution? That is absolutely wrong. And I'm here with Dr. Cornelius Hunter, who's ready to talk about the problems with protein evolution today. Welcome, Dr. Hunter.
Thank you, Rebecca. Delighted to be here again.
Thanks. Okay, so what's the bottom line? What is going on with protein evolution?
Yeah, so protein evolution, proteins are complex, and the evolution of complex things has always been a problem for evolution. How does the biological world evolve? Major problem for evolution. Proteins have always been a good example of that, or at least since the mid 1900s. It's been a great example of how does evolution actually come up with proteins. And this year, Eugene Koonin came out with a paper which says it solved this long-standing problem. It's an astonishing paper. Yeah, there it is. And Eugene Koonin is a very good researcher, by the way. I don't want to say negative things about his work. He's done great work. But this paper is a very subtle problem, an example of a very subtle problem in the evolutionary literature, which is actually an enormous problem. It's bogus science, and it needs to be understood, but it's not simple to understand. So that's what I want to get into, but I want to give some background first. And with a drink of water, I will go there. So there's a key concept, which is not only important for understanding this paper, but in general, anybody who wants to understand origins and evolution and the impact on our culture and everything that's happening needs to understand this one concept called teleology. It's a word that a lot of people have heard, but don't quite understand, what exactly does this mean? So I want to get everybody up to speed on what this word means, and we'll go forward from there, because it's going to play a key role in understanding this new scientific paper from Eugene Koonin this year. So imagine, I'm going to give an example here. Just imagine you're walking along a beach and you come upon some wood. There's a pile of wood, some wood strewn around. Maybe there was a shipwreck and the wood got washed ashore. Was there a purpose there? No, there's no purpose. You walk along some further away and you find a dock. There's some wood. It's in the form of a dock. A beautiful dock. People are on the dock jumping off into the water. There's a boat hooked up to the dock. Is there a purpose to that wood? Yes, of course, there's a purpose. What is that wood for? It is for accessing the water, diving, swimming, parking your boat, and so forth. Very obvious example of where there's no purpose and there is a purpose. Here's another one. Let's go back to the wood that's strewn about. A tornado comes, sweeps up the wood, and slams it down in the form of a dock. And so the next day, it's a beautiful day, and there's people out there starting to use this structure. There's this structure. You can dive off into the water. You can park your boat there. It's a structure that has the form of a dock. Now, would you say that that structure is for swimming? Is it for parking your boat? No, you wouldn't say that. Why not? What you would say is it's a structure that happened to form, and it just happened to have a functional benefits. It happened to provide for swimming and diving and parking your boat, but it's not for those things. Why is that? What's this word for? What's going on with this word for? Well, the word for in this context entails agency. It entails intent. There is what's it for? It's for swimming. Oh, that entails an intent. And we all know that the tornado did not have that intent. So you don't say that it was for swimming. It happened to be functional. It happened to work for swimming, for accessing the water. If you can get that kind of distinction there, then you understand the word teleology. This is what the word teleology is getting at. Was there an intent? And of course, where there's an intent, there is that implies an agent, a creator, a designer, and so forth. So there's a lot of rich things all of a sudden come open when you explore these linguistic implications.
And this is an issue because evolution can't have an agent.
Right, and I'll explain, and I'm going right there because the you might, some people might be saying, okay, that interesting example, but I mean, tornadoes don't do that. That's never happened in the history of the world. It's kind of an esoteric, sounds like an academic example, sounds like an academic term that philosophers sit around arguing about. No, actually, it is important because there are people historically and today and who believe that that tornado did that in that sense. In the fact, they believe that things far, far, far more complex than a dock arose by themselves. They arose spontaneously by natural forces that did not have them in mind, blind forces. Things just happened to arise. You can look at the biological world for plenty of examples of that. So very complicated things that dwarf the dock, and people insist that they arose spontaneously. Now, they would, of course, just to forestall the obvious, evolutionists will say, no, it's natural selection. Well, no, natural selection cannot induce mutations to happen. They kill off bad mutations. It kills off bad mutations, but natural selection is not the savior here. Every mutation, every change, biological change that caused the brain and the bald eagle and all these things to arise, the tens of millions of species to arise, all those changes had to have happened by themselves, by chance, according to evolutionary theory. So we need to understand what the theory is saying here. So it's not just a bad, this tornado forming the dock is not just some academic example. They're insisting on this, and you can go back to the Epicureans for this, where this originally came from. An example they used was teeth. What are your teeth for? And you say, well, that's obvious. The teeth are for chewing. Well, they would say, no, the teeth are not for chewing. The teeth are good at chewing, and so they persisted. Sounds kind of a strange thing to say. Why are they saying this? What's the point? Why are they taking this kind of weird position? This is kind of is this a weird ancient Greek thing? No, actually, because this persists to today with evolutionists. The reason they're saying that is because if you say that the teeth are for chewing, you're implying intent, and you're implying a designer and a creator and all those things. And therefore, you are assigning to that creator toothaches and a whole list of other things that we don't like about the world. So there's a whole raft of arguments of why God would not have created this world. God would not have, should not have, could not have, didn't. We know that God didn't create this world. And some of them deal with the evils and the disutilities and the pain and the bad things, the diseases and so forth of the world. Some of them deal with doctrines of God. Some of them deal with doctrines of man. So it's all over the map. But there's more than a dozen of these arguments that are religious theological arguments about why God would not have created this world. This forces the Epicureans into this position of saying, no, you cannot say that the teeth are for chewing. They must, like that unrealistic dock example where the tornado forms a dock. God, these teeth cannot be intended for. They must have arisen by chance. They used their mechanism was randomly swerving atoms. Okay, so randomly swerving atoms created everything in the world.
Hey, not much different than what's being proposed today.
Exactly. Not much different. Random. Now we have random mutations. They had random motion. We have random mutations. Same sort of an idea. So fast forward to modern times and Charles Darwin, and even before Darwin, but certainly at Darwin and after Darwin, this was elucidated equally with the evolutionists. They made it very clear. It's not for, teeth are not for chewing. Everything arose, as Darwin explained, by random change that was then inherited and retained by natural selection. So it is core to evolutionary theory, anti-teleology. It is an anti-teleological worldview, not a scientific finding, theological view, theological mandate. Anti-teleology, nothing can have a purpose or reason in this world. And so I hope that kind of gets across this idea of teleology and what it's getting at and how important it is today, that it's crucial. And evolution, of course, has swept over the world, and it's the dominant paradigm in academia and in our culture amongst the elites and so forth. So a very important idea that has had wide cultural implications. And that's the context I wanted to set.
Can I ask something about that though? Because there are people who will hear this and they're gonna say, I don't care what the Epicureans thought. I don't care about all this theological stuff. I'm just going by the science. And the science shows evolution is true. So that's why I believe in these natural processes. So what's your response to that?
So what we're going to see is that this anti-teleology is not merely a theological mandate for evolution. It's actually persisting in evolutionary theory itself. And so when you say, well, the science proves evolution, no, it's actually being driven by the anti-teleology. And so you have to understand the role of anti-teleology, not just in the Epicureans and the history of thought and Darwin and everything. It's in today's science. It is a virus in today's science. So this history and this philosophy and understanding the word teleology is very important. So you can read the literature and you can see it for yourself. So that's where I'm going to go now. The first and most obvious implication or use of anti-teleology, manifestation of anti-teleology in evolution today is just in the narratives that they talk about. Any popular book, presentation on television, and journal articles, scientific journal papers are using teleological language. It's pervasive in the language. You can just see this over and over again. And I talk about this on my blog a lot. I'll give you just simple examples of, fur is for keeping animals warm. Wings are for flying. So the for or the to provide, these intent words are all through the literature. And they're evolutionists are communicating and thinking in terms of teleology. Now, remember, just a minute ago, I said they are profoundly anti-teleological. They reject, insist the world cannot be teleological. There can be no reason. And yet, when you look under the hood and crack the book and read the evolution literature, they're all of a sudden resorting to teleological language a lot. Why is that? Well, I'll give you two reasons. One is that the world exudes teleology just everywhere throughout the world, especially the biological world. Things are finely adapted to their needs, and they just really, really look like there's a purpose there. And so there's that. But the second thing is evolutionary theory has failed and failed badly. It's failed hard. And on my channel, you can see I have a paper on the failed predictions of evolution. There's dozens of fundamental predictions that evolution has made that have failed over and over again. So the theory is consistently failing. Surprise, surprise. The idea that the world arose by itself isn't doing so well. I mean, that's kind of a heroic theory. So in order to have a narrative, in order to communicate your theory to an audience, whether it's students or other evolutionists reading your paper, it's most convenient to use teleological language. If you're using the language of evolution, it sounds really awkward and really bad. This arose randomly and now it's doing this. It just doesn't sound right. And so you're finding teleological language throughout the literature. It's as though, imagine a flat earther using round earth terminology all the time, or a geocentrist using heliocentrist language all the time. Or imagine a Republican politician using Democrat talking points. Or imagine a Democratic politician using Republican talking points. You say, wait a minute, you're confusing. What's going on here? Oh, well, pay no attention to what I'm actually saying. That's essentially what's going on here. Pay no attention to my words. because evolutionists, at least some evolutionists, are aware of this. They're aware that there's this weird thing going on where you have all this teleological language in a worldview, a theory that is profoundly anti-teleological. So what's going on? They've tried to explain this. And one of the most common explanations is it's just shorthand. Pay no attention to that. We're just trying to explain things to people in a simple manner. Well, that doesn't work very well. Another explanation, Jamie Freestone came out with a paper earlier this year on the idea that, well, it's the nature of language. It's just the nature of language that you can't avoid teleological explanations. That didn't work out very well either. By the way, I was a peer reviewer on that paper. So they've struggled to explain this. And the reasons why, the actual reason why there's all this teleological language is because, as I said, the theory is failing. And so you have to try and build narratives to explain the theory, and you're going to fall back on teleological language. Now, the one fallback argument that they have is, okay, yeah, we got a problem, we're working on it. Maybe you're making some points here, but it's not affecting the science. This is all narrative. It's not in the science. No, it's in the science also. And I'll give you a couple of examples. This is a fascinating area of research that very few people understand and very few people know about. You can get a PhD in biology, a PhD in history and philosophy of science. You will not be taught this. It's an emerging area of research, I think. And there's no one simple answer to this. The manifestation of of teleological ideas in the science, in what's supposed to be evolutionary science, is a very complex and varied subject. I'm going to give you two examples. One of them is selection pressure. Now, what is selection pressure? The term selection pressure is a classic term from evolutionary theory. It goes back a long ways. It's a perfectly good term. What it means is if you have an environmental change, it might favor one existing part of a population or one existing species versus another species. I'll give you a classic example, or a classic example. Moths. You have a population of moths. Some are dark, some are light colored. The light colored ones like to set on a white colored background for camouflage. The dark ones like to set on a dark colored background for camouflage. Maybe there's an environmental shift where let's say the white background areas diminish. There's no longer light colored objects for them to land on. Well, they're going to have trouble and they're going to be killed off more readily. So that's that's a selection pressure. That's an example of a selection pressure favoring the dark colored moths. The key thing to understand about the concept of selection pressure is it's favoring an existing phenotype, an existing part of the population, or an existing species versus another species. It's something that's existing. So environmental shift favors something that's existing. Well, if you look in the literature, the evolution literature, selection pressure, the term selection pressure has been abused consistently, repeatedly. It's been abused to now call for the favoring of something that doesn't exist. And so it comes to exist, it evolves because of the selection pressure. So selection pressure is providing a pressure, a force to bring out something that didn't exist. In my channel, I have a recent video on just an example that came up this summer, a paper out of Phil Barden's lab on myrmecophagy. Myrmecophagy is the ability to eat insects, ants and termites, like an anteater or an aardvark. And this paper shows that this myrmecophagy has evolved at least 12 different times independently. So that's not a good sign for evolution. Evolution wants common descent. So it's another failure of common descent. But the point is, in that paper, they used this concept of selection pressure and how you had a rising population of ants worldwide, more and more ants. And that applied a selection pressure that brought out myrmecophagy where there was none. So you now have this emergence of this interesting way of feeding where you have this real long tongue sticks out.
Yes, and I heard your video on that, and the terminology that I've seen with regard to the selection pressure is evolutionary strategies. So basically, the organism is developing an evolutionary strategy.
Exactly.
And
That's a
yeah.
great example. You see those sorts of phrases, these kind of, the gambler here, he's doing something, he's taking action. It is hilarious, actually, when you read through the literature to see all these different ways of them describing these teleological descriptions. But it was an abuse of the term selection pressure, because that is not selection pressure. Selection pressure is on an existing phenotype or an existing species. They are using it a way to smother over the problem of how, and Barden actually states that, yeah, this is an amazing evolution. How did this thing evolve? This capability. It calls for different, big changes in the mouth and the jaw and the digestive system. So how did that happen? It's from something that was totally different. Big problem. Another big problem. Well, they cover it over. They mask the problem by simply, selection pressure. It was selection pressure. No, that's not how selection pressure works. So it's a term that's been abused, and what it is creating is a teleological explanation. It's like, there was a target. What's the target? Ants. There's all these ants as an opportunity. And so this evolved. So there was a reason. Myrmecophagy evolved for feeding off of ants. And that's just not how evolutionary theory works. You can't do that. And so they're cheating. They're making an unlikely theory sound likely by using teleological explanations, even though when you turn the page or you pick up another book, you see they're profoundly anti-teleological. So the foundation of the theory is profoundly anti-teleological, and then you pick up the other book and you read these teleological explanations in order to make the theory sound good. The second example that I have, and this is our topic, was this new paper from Eugene Koonin and collaborators on protein evolution. They solved the problem of protein evolution. This would be a monumental paper if true. What are proteins? Proteins are a long chain of amino acids. Amino acids are relatively small molecules, so it's kind of like this chain here, where each link is an amino acid. So you have these amino acids lined up on, in a line. The shortest ones are 30 or 40 amino acids. They're usually hundreds, sometimes even thousands of amino acids lined up in a chain. And these are created in the cell using the genetic code, and the information coming into the code that's going to create this sequence of amino acids is from the DNA. So it's a gene in the DNA coming in and coding for this string of amino acids. Now, there's 20 different amino acids that are used typically in the cell to make proteins. So you think of it as basically like a line of letters where each of the 20 amino acids can be represented with a letter. So you have 20, an English letter. So you have this kind of string of letters, and that's that string of letters that determines how this thing is going to fold up and what kind of a protein it's going to make. That sequence of amino acids is critical and crucial. And that's determined by the gene that's in the DNA. It determines the sequence of amino acids. So evolution has this problem of how could this evolve? If you think of it, okay, there's 20, I said there's 20 different amino acids. And let's look at a protein of 100, a relatively small protein, 100 amino acids. How many different possible sequences are there? Well, at the first one, there's 20 different amino acids. At the second one, there's still 20. At the third one, there's still 20. So it's 20 times 20 times 20 times 20, all the way to 100. That's the number of possible sequences that you could have. 20 raised to the power of 100. That is an astronomically large number. You can't really even get your head around it. It's so big of a number. The evolutionary process somehow has to search around and find the right sequence of amino acids that's going to code for this gene. It's going to fold up in the right position and do the function that it's supposed to do. There's this Monty Python show, this Monty Python skit of hide and seek, where they're playing hide and seek. Some people may have seen this. It's a global hide and seek. So they start out in England, and it's okay. I'm going to count to 100. And the other guy runs out the room, and he can go anywhere in the world. So he runs off to the airport. Gets on a plane, flies to Spain. Gets around a car, drives to this little town. There's a little monastery. Climbs up these stairs. And he's like hiding, behind this cement wall. And this other guy's in England. Okay, I'm going to come find you now. That is a hilarious skit. That is what it's like for evolution to find a protein sequence. It's just there's very few answers in an enormous search space. 20 to raise to the power of 100 is the number of possible sequences, and how many of them are going to actually create a protein. There's thousands and thousands, millions and millions, but it's a small number compared to the space that they're searching.
Yeah, and can you tell people more about like what proteins are, how vital they are? Like you can't have life without many proteins working together. So can you describe proteins a little bit? Because I actually hate the word protein. It doesn't capture exactly what we're talking about. So can you describe what is a protein?
Yeah, and you want to probably go to the internet and search on protein, just look at examples and stuff to see how cool they are. But yeah, proteins perform a lot of different jobs in the body. Without them, you die instantly. When you're digesting food, when you're all kinds of jobs. When you're synthesizing chemicals, when you're making proteins, you have to have proteins that help do that job. So they are basically agents. They're little machines going around doing jobs. When you need to access the DNA to copy a gene, it's a protein machine that slides along the DNA, opens up the double helix, and makes a copy of one of the helices. So that's a protein machine. When you edit that copy, that's a protein machine with many, many proteins. When you digest food, when you're eating a piece of bread, you're bringing in this bread, and that's going to be converted to energy, chemical energy or potential energy that could be used to think, to walk, to move, to do all the things we do. It's proteins that are doing the job of breaking down those nutrients, those carbon-carbon bonds, and turning those into energy, converting those into a different form of energy. So, I mean, it would take hours to describe all the different jobs that they do. They're also structural. Proteins are simply serving as structures in the body. And so they're enzymes that speed up reactions. They're structures that provide structural strength, all kinds of things. So, and what's interesting is your needs are changing constantly. You go out and run, you eat a meal, you fast for a while, you get in cold weather, you don't have a coat. All these different conditions require physiological responses. Those physiological responses require different proteins. So your body is constantly making new proteins and then breaking down old proteins that are no longer needed. So it's this beehive of activity in your cells of accessing the right place in your DNA, get the right gene, open it up, copy it, bring it over to the ribosome, edit it, and then bring it over to the ribosome, make copies, and then go off and gets used, all within seconds of time, creating these little machines that do these things and then breaking them down when you're done. It's a fascinating activities going on all the time so that you can function. You're totally unaware of all this stuff that's happening. This incredible complexity. So yeah, protein it's a great point, Rebecca. Proteins are just unbelievably complex, unbelievably necessary, and fascinating. It's a fascinating topic.
And even in the simplest cell, even just a single-celled organism needs many proteins to function. So this isn't a thing that we can pass off to later stages of evolution. You have to have all of these many proteins. And that kind of, I wanted to put up, Travis says, why is it a problem? This is in response to your talk about trying to, get amino acids to configure into a protein. So why is it a problem to get that?
Yeah. So how is this gets to the Koonin paper? So you have it's this Monty Python skit, playing global hide and seek. How can you find when the guy is in England and the other guy is hiding in Spain, and the guy in England goes to France? Is he closer? Yes, he's closer. Does he know he's closer? No. He doesn't know that he's closer. He goes to Spain. Is he closer? Yes, he's closer. Does he know it? No. What I'm pointing out here is the search problem is not easy because you don't have a sense of where you are until you're very close and you can hear the guy breathing or scrambling away or something. That's the way it is with protein, searching for those protein sequences. Is not only is the space enormous, when you get halfway there, you have no sense that you've made it. The fit. What has to happen for evolution is, let's say you have a random gene or a gene that's not a stretch of DNA that doesn't code for a protein, and evolutionists think that it eventually evolved to code for a protein. Okay, so that's the evolutionary hypothesis. That's the evolutionary mandate. You've got a section of DNA, doesn't do anything, and then later it codes for a protein. Now, how are you going to do that? You're going to mutate the nucleotides in that DNA. One at a time, they're going to mutate. So let's say you get halfway there to the protein, to a protein that's going to help the cell. Is it going to provide more fitness? If you're halfway there to this potential protein, you have to have some sort of an improvement in fitness. It does something for you such that natural selection will maintain that. That's the process of natural selection. It's helping the organism, and therefore organisms with that half gene coding do better than its neighbors, and so it persists in future generations. I've just described natural selection. So you have to have a benefit, a fitness benefit, as you start to introduce mutations that take you toward that protein. So here you are in this space. There's a protein sequence, a sequence that codes for a protein. You're over here somewhere with a useless DNA sequence. You randomly, just by luck, mutate toward that protein, or any protein. You're just mutating toward a protein. Is it going to provide an improvement? No, it doesn't. You don't get an improvement. You don't get a fitness. It's not going to help you fitness-wise to be 10% of the way towards a protein, 1% of the way toward a protein, 50% of the way toward a protein. It's not like, oh, I'm now reproducing more. I'm now surviving better. I'm gonna out-compete my neighbors. No, it's not going to happen. You have to get very close to that sequence. So the problem of protein evolution, how did proteins evolve, as I started out, it's a big problem. It's a problem that has been a big problem for many, many years. It just seems to be getting more difficult. Evolutionists have struggled with this. How does this happen? They've written a lot of papers on it. What we do have is papers showing how unlikely it is, that the astronomical odds that against evolving a protein. So
it boils down to nature cannot select unless the machine is completely working. If you don't have a working machine, it doesn't matter how many machine parts you have. Just like if your car doesn't drive, then it doesn't matter how many car parts you have. It's not going to help you. And so we can't appeal to natural selection. So there's no way to get to the full machine.
Which is a good way of putting it, Rebecca. And there's an old kind of quip along these lines that evolutionists have admitted to, which is, what good is half a wing? What good is half a wing? What good is half a protein? What good is 10% of a protein? It doesn't provide you that good. So the search problem is very difficult. It's just like this Monty Python skit of traveling around the globe trying to find somebody. So given that as background, now you understand, okay, there are these things called proteins. They are difficult. They're coded for by the DNA, genes in the DNA. Somehow evolution has to evolve a gene that codes for a protein. Somehow it has to find the sequence of nucleotides it's going to code for this sequence of amino acids. It's a huge search space. How are you going to do this? It's a difficult problem. It's a legitimately very difficult problem. And evolutionists have not come up with a good solution for decades and decades. Now, with that as background, here we are, the year 2025, and Eugene Koonin and collaborators comes out with a paper which is kind of out of the blue, just oh, by the way, we solved the protein evolution problem. Okay, next. It's just, whoa, wait a minute, let's have a look at this. This is pretty important. What exactly did you do? How did you solve this? So this is where the teleology is going to come in. The clever, subtle teleology. So remember, I introduced this topic of teleology and how evolution is profoundly anti-teleological, and yet they resort to teleology in order to make the theory work and in order to communicate the theory to people. They have to go and dip into that well. And I use the example of selection pressure as one example of how the teleology actually gets into the science and is corrupting the science. Here's another example. So there are all these examples out there that are all different and subtle, kind of infecting the science. What happened here? So in this case, let's go back to this problem. You have a segment of DNA doesn't code for a protein. It's some random sequence of nucleotides. You're mutating them, and you're hoping to get a sequence that codes for a protein. Now, when a protein is created, remember, it's a linear chain of amino acids, as I said. And as that's created, it's created one at a time, one amino acid to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And you're tacking on these amino acids. There's hundreds or thousands of these things, and it's flailing around here in the cell as it's being created. And then it folds up. It may be folding up as it's being created, but in the end, it's folding up into some sort of a glob, at least the globular proteins that do these jobs. You have this glob. When it folds up, you're going to have a lot of amino acids that are neighbors that were not neighbors to begin with. So there's an amino acid here and an amino acid here, and now they're neighbors. And we call those long-range contacts. So long-range because they are long range away in the primary sequence, but in the folded up structure, which is called the tertiary structure, they're neighbors and they're actually interacting. There's a chemical interaction. So we call that a long range contact. And the theory of, so you have these long range contacts. And so when you have a globular protein, there's going to be a lot of long range contacts, right? There's going to be, a lot of these things because they're now next to each other, a lot of neighbors. So it is a given. It is a no-brainer property of globular proteins that they have a lot of long-range contacts. That is a given. Whereas a protein that is formed from a random string of amino acids isn't going to have very many long-range contacts. It may be flailing around, may be unstable. It may form transient contacts and they go away. And so you can have some long-range contacts, but you're not going to have so many as you have with a globular protein. So you need long-range contacts. So if you're going to evolve a protein, if evolution is true, and these genes randomly evolve until they finally form a protein, as those mutations occur one at a time, they're going to tend to result in a resulting protein that has more long-range contacts than before. If evolution is true, that's somehow going to happen. The problem is as you add more long-range contacts, you're still at the half a wing problem. So now you're like this. It's still not going to do anything for the organism unless you just get wildly lucky. Even if you formed a full protein, by the way, it might not help the organism. It depends on what the protein does. It's a very difficult problem. How are you going to benefit the organism? It needs to be a protein that it needs. So you evolving this gene, you're introducing mutations. If you're really lucky, the resulting amino acid chain starts to look a little bit more like a protein, starts to fold up a little bit, and maybe there's more long-range contacts. But there's no fitness advantage. You're not getting a better, more progeny from that organism. It's got this half a protein floating around, a tenth of a protein. So again, this problem, you have to have something that's close to actually a real protein to benefit. What do they do in this paper, this Eugene Koonin paper?
Before you go into what did they do in this paper, can I just ask, because I can just hear some people object and say, well, maybe it wouldn't help if you had, it's not quite a protein, but you've got so many tries. And so what if you have all of these like partial built proteins and you've just got so many tries with so much time and evolution that, hey, so is that a problem? Like, is it damaging to have half proteins floating around in a cell?
Yeah, so you don't really have nearly as many tries as you need. So this is where this astronomical number needs to be appreciated, and it's hard to appreciate this. We can't get our mind around it. But the number of the search space, again, it's a global search that the Monty Pythons get. It is, how many tries would I need to find a guy in Spain? And I don't know he's in Spain. I just know he's in the world somewhere. Well, I have so many tries. I mean, look, I got decades. I got a lot of money. I can fly around the world. I got a lot of time. I don't have a lot of money, but I'm just pretending here. I got frequent flyer miles. I can fly around the world. I can do all these things. I got a lot of time. That's not going to help, right? It's some guy in Spain somewhere. You could have hundreds. You could have thousands of trips, of attempts. You're still not going to find the guy. So you need to appreciate the astronomical problem we're talking about. This isn't a problem where, a few more tries is going to help. By the way, there was a paper in the Royal Society a few years ago that made this argument. They said, look, people talk about this problem of protein evolution. We have more tries than you think. And they actually went through a calculation and they showed, we've got 10 to the 40th tries. We got all kinds of tries here. So you're underestimating evolution. It was a profoundly problematic paper. First of all, what they didn't realize is 10 to the 40th wasn't enough. So it's kind of hilarious. They thought that was a big number. It's not a big number. When you look at the problem of protein evolution, you need 10 to the 70th easily. And that's for a simple problem. For more complicated proteins, it's much bigger number. So they were kind of naive about it. But secondly, when they came up with their number of 10 to the 40th, they were assuming the pre-existence of proteins. They needed proteins to make these experiments. So they're trying to solve the problem of protein evolution, but their assumption, their model entails the pre-existence of proteins. So it's circular. So you can't. It's just, unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. You can't just say, "Gee, we have a lot of tries."
Because even if you get one, it doesn't matter. You need many,
and that too.
If you don't have many working together all at once, then even if you got one, then the cell is going to die. And so you're going to
exactly. It's like having, one cylinder in your car or something. I mean, it's just, there are thousands and thousands of proteins, not to mention all the other molecular machines in the cell that have to work together. This isn't just a claptrap of just things floating around helping you to survive. It's a very complicated system that entails many, many, many different entities, molecular entities working together. So it's a big problem. So what did this Eugene Koonin paper do to solve the problem of protein evolution? They set up a simulation they called the Protein Fold Evolution Simulator, Protein Fold Evolution Simulator, PFES, in which they said that they simulated the process of evolution. And in that simulation, they're going to see if they can evolve proteins. In the computers, it's all numerical in the computer, but they're going to try and, run these algorithms and show how when you roll the dice and you introduce random mutations into a random gene, you can get mutations that will end up with a protein. Not all the time, it fails a lot, but it worked enough that it was convincing. They got enough successes that it was like, yeah, okay, given the time that we have, we could build proteins, and we can build meaningful proteins, not just random proteins, but proteins that help the cell work. It was a huge claim. Well, how did they do that? What they did was they said, every time a random mutation occurs, you have to judge it as to whether natural selection it's going to add fitness. If it adds fitness, then via natural selection, it's going to tend to be maintained. And so you want to have a trail of these helpful, positive mutations that lead you to a folded up protein. And so how are you going to judge those? How are you going to determine what the fitness is of a mutation that's going to change the amino acid sequence by one amino acid? There's one amino acid is going to change from a random sequence of amino acids. How are you going to decide, is this fitness improving, or is it fitness neutral, or is it fitness degrading? That's called a fitness landscape or a fitness function. You need to have a function that describes, yeah, this is good or this is not good. And let me take a drink. The function that they used was driven by, the main component of this function was the number of long-range contacts. So remember I said, you're going to have long-range contacts forming, because in the end, that globular protein has a lot of long-range contacts. So you're going from a very small number to a large number. How are you going to do it? Well, they programmed that into their fitness function. They said, if a mutation results in a greater number of long-range contacts, it may only be one more. You may be going from 0 to 1, or 1 to 2, or 2 to 3. We're going to call that a fitness increase. And so we're going to have that preserved in our simulation. So natural selection is going to preserve that. Next, let's do it again. Next. So you're injecting these mutations one after the other, and if they result in a greater number of long-range contacts, save it. If it doesn't, throw it away, and run through all these mutations over and over and over again, and slowly but surely, as you're predicting what's going to happen with the folded. They're having to predict it, by the way. This is all in a computer, so they're predicting what the structure is going to look like. If that prediction includes more, if it reveals more long-range contacts, save it. And so, yeah, you run that thing for an hour, and the thing slowly gets more and more and more condensed, and you end up with something that looks like a realistic native protein, globular protein.
So they knew the destination they wanted to get to, and so they're helping it get to the destination. But natural selection doesn't know the destination it needs to get to.
Exactly. They cheated. They included information about the destination. They knew that you were going to have a bunch of long-range contacts. So let's make that part of the fitness function. Whereas in true evolution, an additional long-range contact typically is not going to help you. You certainly, there's no scientific evidence that adding a single long-range contact or a couple of long-range contacts is going to result in higher fitness. So they cheated. They included the target information. It's like if I'm searching for this guy in Spain and I'm flying around the world and traveling around the world, and I get to France, I'm going to know that I'm closer. I have this little secret. I'm cheating. I have this little calculator, this little cell phone that's telling me. So I have a guy on the other end telling, you're closer, you're closer. And true enough, if you watch that skit, the guy does find him. He does go to Spain and he finds him. Of course, that's just all in the Monty Python skit. So that's it. It's cheating. It's teleological, because it's including the endpoint information, that it's including the goal as you said, Rebecca. So these teleological assumptions are cropping up in all kinds of different ways in evolutionary theory. Whereas evolutionists will tell you, no, it's only in the narrative. Yeah, we resort to this. It's shorthand. It's a convenience. That's all it is. Pay no attention to what we say. Well, no, it reflects a problem with your thinking and communicating the theory and the way you think about the theory, but it also is indeed infecting the science. So there's a problem there. Now, there's one other interesting aspect about this Koonin paper. A problem. There's actually a couple of problems that I think I should just touch on briefly, just to give you an idea of the degree of cheating that's going on. So there's a lot more cheating going on than what I pointed out. But that's an interesting. What I just pointed out, I wanted to get to because it's it's teleological. Another problem is that when you do this whole simulation, you're simulating, the testing out of proteins, you're mutating the gene, and then it's being translated into a string of amino acids. Well, how is it being converted into a string of amino acids? Well, that's what's called the genetic code, the standard genetic code. Well, how does the genetic code work in the cell? Well, it's a very complicated process, and it entails an army of proteins. In fact, just the copying of the gene, when you copy the gene, that's an army of proteins. When you edit the gene, that's an army. When you translate it, that's an army. When you recharge the tRNAs, that's an army. There's all these proteins around. So they're trying to simulate the evolution, the first evolution of proteins, but yet they require they require proteins just to have that process work. Now, what they say to that criticism is, well, we're using a genetic code that doesn't use proteins, and we're copying the DNA in a way that doesn't use proteins. Well, how does that work? It's all speculation. It's all hypothetical. Nothing has ever been observed. No such thing has ever been observed, anything like it. There's no such thing as a standard genetic code that doesn't use proteins. So this is just wild, speculation in this paper. It's a contingency of the paper that is, undercuts everything. Another problem is, I mentioned the question of, okay, so you have a mutation, you're going to translate this new gene into a string of amino acids. One of the amino acids changed because you had a mutation. What's going to happen? Is it going to fold up? How much is it going to fold up? What's going to how much? What's the structure going to look like after you introduce this mutation? Well, that alone is an enormous theoretical problem. We don't really know what it's going to look like. We do have some decent tools that predict what that structure is going to look like, but they really only work for native proteins or close to native proteins. So, we've got tens of thousands of examples, proteins that we have looked at, analyzed, and we know the structure, we know the amino acid sequence. And so we've fed all that information into AI tools. And so we have these now AI tools that you give it a sequence of amino acids, and it will predict a structure. But these tools have been trained on real proteins or close to real proteins. Like they introduce some mutations, and they see what happens with the structure. All that information is fed into the AI tools. The AI tools are not trained on the vast universe of all these sequences that we don't even know about. There's this astronomical number of sequences. What would happen if you had this random sequence? What's it going to look like? We have no idea. The AI tools aren't trained on it. They've never seen that before. They're trained on the few tens of thousands data points around in this enormous space that actually contain a real protein or something close to a real protein. So that's what they know. So there's a bias toward real structures. So if you're feeding this tool a randomized sequence, it's probably going to come up with something that looks a little bit more real than it actually is. It's going to come up with, so that whole process is highly questionable. Of, is this? It's a convenient thing for them to use, but it really does. It's very questionable. It's an assumption that they would have to do a lot more work on. For example, take some of they evolved a protein, take some of those sequences along the way and actually take it into the lab and see what it produces. See what actually happens when you feed that sequence of amino acids into a cellular environment. What is going to come out, and then compare that to what you predicted, your AI tool predicted. And I think there's going to be huge differences. So I think that the whole experimental approach is highly questionable just based on that. So a lot of moving parts here that are in question. But to me, what's interesting is the sneaking in of teleology and calling it science. And by the way, in the paper, they make high claims. Even though they're aware of this, the paper is aware of what they're doing. They claim we've shown the evolutionary process. We have demonstrated the evolution of proteins. They're not making low claims like, well, yeah, we know we have these problems, but at least it's an interesting thing that we did. No, they're making high claims that this is a simulation of the evolutionary process, and it's totally legitimate. Now, I wrote a letter to the editor of the journal explaining these issues and how the conclusions did not follow from the results. And I got a polite response telling me, well, thank you, but we're not going to publish your letter. It's not really contributing to the discussion. So I wasn't surprised, but I felt the duty to at least send the letter. And now the paper is being cited by other papers as legitimate science. So this is going to become ingrained in this as time goes by. It's being cited, and it'll be cited more and more. So it's going to become a legitimate way of doing science in the eyes of evolutionists. It will gain momentum, just like selection pressure. For many years now, it's been used inappropriately in this teleological sense. Same thing with this paper now. It's going to gain this momentum. So the science is problematic. The evolutionary science is highly problematic.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting to me, and I recommend this to people who want to look into the evidence for evolution. Just read the papers that are put out by evolutionists, and you'll get some of the best admissions of the problems. And this paper is no exception to that, because here he admits at the very beginning, the origin and evolution of protein folds are among the most challenging, long-standing problems in biology. Now, if he wasn't offering a solution, would he admit that? Because you talk, you hear all these great we have so much evidence for evolution, we've got it figured out, but then they make the admissions when they're suggesting a new solution. So that's where you'll get the admissions. This is protein evolution is a problem, and we have that by the author of the paper admitting that. And after the paper, it's still a problem. That is the truth. So thank you for sharing that, Dr. Hunter.
Rebecca, I just got to say, you just hit a salient point. That's a really good point. I really appreciate that you do find the evolutionists in denial of problems for years and years, and they'll push back and say, oh, you guys don't understand evolutionists, you creationists, you idiots, you just don't understand the science, you don't understand evolutionary theory, shut up. But then when they are comfortable that they have a solution, suddenly the admissions come out. Yeah, this is a huge problem, and here's why, and blah, blah, blah. And then now we have a solution for it. And then the solution itself is problematic. So you have to understand how to read the literature, which you obviously are keen to seeing those things, Rebecca, because that's a typical trend in the literature. The admissions come later when they think they have a solution, inevitably those solutions don't actually work.
Now, we had this come up as a comment. Tyler said, I'm hearing an argument from incredulity here. So, what is your response to this? Are you just making an argument from incredulity?
I just don't believe it. I mean, come on, this just doesn't work. And plus, I'm a religious guy and I don't believe it. You're always going to get this. So this is a standard pushback from evolutionists. Oh, it's an argument from incredulity. Have you listened to what I'm saying at all? This is not at all an argument from incredulity. It's not even close. This is an argument from science and analyzing the literature. This is a problem with the science. This isn't incredulity. So if you criticize the theory, you're going to get a whole raft of bogus arguments just with the intent of theory protection. So philosophers call this theory protectionism. So instead of engaging, Mr. Nelson in your 7th grade science class taught you that scientists are skeptical by nature, and they're always trying to shoot down theories, and they want to criticize theories. They're very critical people. That's all false. No, they're very conservative. They protect. And philosophers call this theory protectionism. And so when you come at a theory with criticism, with valid criticism that needs to be addressed, instead of engaging the criticism, acknowledging it, and then addressing it in some way, you get these raft of bogus arguments, these theory protectionism arguments, like, oh, that's just incredulity. No, it's not incredulity. It's science. I'm talking about the science. We're talking about molecular biology here. This is the science of how proteins evolve, how proteins fold, and what this paper says. So there's nothing. So if you come at a theory with criticism, then you are expressing disbelief that they have done it right. And so, oh, that's incredulity. No, it's actually pointing out mistakes. I believe they are making mistakes. If you can point out where I'm wrong in my criticism, then great. So yeah, theory protectionism is a long-standing problem with science.
Now, what about for people who hear this and they say, well, yes, protein evolution is the problem, but we have so much evidence for evolution that we know it had to work out some way.
Right. Yeah. So, and evolutionists do say this, it was a famous meeting in 1967 with mathematicians in Philadelphia, where the mathematicians said to the evolutionists, it's not working. You don't have enough time. Evolution is not really possible. And the evolutionists, including Ernst Mayr, leading evolutionist from Harvard, responded, well, there must be something wrong with your calculations because we know evolution is true. So when you have a problem with a theory, you don't want to fall back on, well, we know it's true, so don't worry about it. It'll get solved sometime. It's rather, it is a problem. I mean, it has to be chalked up with, okay, this is a problem with a theory. If you look at my paper on the false predictions of evolution, there's dozens of false predictions. At some point, you realize, oh, this is a pattern. This is the history of evolutionary thought. You have false predictions happening over and over and over again. Fundamental predictions of the theory that are false. That should mean something. That counts. And so you can't just fall back on, well, we know evolution is true. Now there's another consideration here, which is, okay, well, when someone says that, someone says, well, come on, yeah, you got a problem. Okay, cool. It'll get solved sometime. We got this mountain of evidence over here. Okay, what's the mountain of evidence? And how is it that you know evolution is true? Because the answer to that question is there is no mountain of evidence. The mountain of evidence is against the theory, not for the theory. And the way that they know that it is true is theological. It is a theological argument. If you look at Darwin's book, it is chock full of theological arguments that mandate the truth of the theory, and nothing has changed since then. If you look at contemporary literature and literature ever since Darwin, all of the evidences and arguments for the fact of evolution are theological, or more generally metaphysical. They're not empirical. They're not driven by the empirical evidence. They're driven by metaphysical considerations of how the theory must be true. God wouldn't act in that way. the world is not what we want. We don't like this world, or man needs naturalism for science to work. So yeah, you've got all these arguments out there that therefore we know evolution is true. Yeah, you know it because of your worldview, not because of the science.
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, is there more that you wanted to say about the evolution of proteins?
No, I think I covered that Koonin paper to the extent that I wanted to. Oh, by the way, I guess one more thing is I do have a written blog which reflects the letter that I sent to the editor at the Discovery Institute blog. So if people want to look that up, but the Discovery Institute, so they can Google my name and Discovery Institute and find that blog. And it was from a few weeks ago, but it just reflects
And
what
later
I
on, I can put the link to that in the chat. I mean, in the description of the video.
Yeah, okay,
well, I wanted to bring up because, exactly what you were saying is also written in the paper itself, talking about the exploration through evolutionary trajectories. It says origin and evolution of protein folds remain an extremely challenging problems because the methodology required for thorough exploration of evolutionary trajectories is still lacking despite major advances in evolutionary genomics, phylogenetics, bioinformatics, and theoretical biophysics during the last decade. So, go ahead.
They do make admissions to the gravity of the problem, the seriousness of the problem, the difficulty. They also, Rebecca, somewhere around there, talk about the difficulty in modeling the fitness landscape, which is what I was homing in on, is this fitness landscape. How do you know that the fitness is improved by a mutation? And they're using long-range contact count to judge that. They admit in the introduction that problem is enormous. How do you come up with a fitness landscape? And so they're well aware. Of course, Eugene Koonin would know all this, so I know that he's aware of it. But they make the admission in the paper that, yeah, this is an enormous problem. How could you know? And they say it's a problem that may not be solvable. It may not admit to a solution. They say that in the paper. And yet they then go on to use a bogus teleological fitness landscape and claim that reflects, that accurately simulates the evolutionary process. So it's interesting that this is the kind of cognitive dissonance in evolutionary thought. I'll give you another simple example of that, which is Richard Dawkins, the famous Richard Dawkins. And he has this example of evolving a Shakespeare line. Methinks it is like a weasel. And if he starts with a random string of English letters and evolves it into this Shakespeare line and says, look, here's an example of how evolution works. So stop sweating it. It works. It's a great theory. Shut up. Now he's using the Shakespeare line as his target. So he's just simply randomizing these letters, and when they get the right letter, he keeps it. And in short order, in like 30 seconds, he's got it's a meaningless, stupid exercise. What's interesting about that is he admits that he's not foolish enough to not know that. So he says, yeah, I know that I'm using the end state. I'm using a teleological fitness function, but still it's good. So they are so entranced by their theory and by any hope, any ray of light that shows it could work, that they're willing to compromise their own name, their own good name, and publish that. And so, yeah, they're making mistakes, but they know they're making mistakes, but they're doing it anyway because they are blinded by the theory. Very interesting dynamics. The whole thing is very interesting, dynamic, but theologically, psychologically, and then the science and the history and the philosophy. So there's just all kinds of things moving parts to why in the world would the world be taken up by this paradigm? Well, it's been around a long time. It didn't start with Darwin. It goes back to the Epicureans, and men have always been searching for ways to get God into a distant Mount Olympus. We want God to be meditating on a distant Mount Olympus. He's not here. Jesus said God knows the number of hairs on your head. No, we don't want that. We don't want a God that knows the number of hairs. I mean, my God, if God knows that about me, please save me. I want God to be a long ways away, please. And just, when the time comes, I'll do my best to defend myself. That we don't want a God that's immanent in the world. Me and my God, God and I are at work every day, says Jesus. That's not the kind of God that evolutionary theory and the Epicureans were promoting.
And, still the biggest complaint, people will still say, no, but you see, you keep bringing religion into it, but this is about pure science. And it's the science that is teaching us about evolution. And so, but this is what I've noticed. And I really encourage people, if you have been told it's the science, find out if that's true. Because what I found is that where evolution is strong is in the intellectual bullying and the media promotion, the academic bullying and the media promotion. And so those are the two places where evolution is strong. Where evolution is weak and should have crumbled a long time ago is the scientific evidence. Scientific evidence is against evolution, but the rhetoric around evolution is very strong. So that is what people are succumbing to. They're going into school, they're being told, you want to be smart, you want to be smart. Smart people believe in evolution. Scientifically minded people believe in evolution.
That's a great point, Rebecca. The social aspect, yeah, and the promotion aspect, I think that's a great point. I came to a similar conclusion to what you just said. It's a parallel conclusion about the arguments and evidences for evolution. I'm a collector of arguments and evidences for evolution. I got fascinated by that years ago, and I wanted to build the strongest case possible for evolution. I wasn't against evolution being true, but I wasn't bought into it either. I was neutral. I was willing to go either way, but I wanted to I was fascinated by these claims that evolution is true. So I wanted to build the strongest argument possible. It's like I just went on a hunt. I started going to the life science libraries and reading through the journal papers and all the popular books and textbooks and, give me every argument I can find. And I found that there was a spectrum of arguments. There's a lot of weak arguments that don't really, it's I don't want to use weak arguments to represent a theory. I want the strongest arguments. But I was cataloging them all. And I was, I had the column of, strong arguments. And it was in the strong arguments where the theology showed up. That's where the theology is. And in the weak arguments that really fall down, there was not so much or no theology. It was just trying to appeal to the science. Like, no, that didn't work. So I kind of similar conclusion to what you just said, that, there's these, where is evolution strong? And what I found it in the arguments, it's strong on the theology, just like the Epicureans.
Wow. Okay, cool. Now I want to get a little nerdy and ask something from the paper, because I've got a biophysicist here and I'm trying to figure out, when I read papers like this, I probably only understand half of it. But I thought this was interesting. It says a detailed scenario has been proposed in which proteins would evolve in the primordial RNA world when ribosomes using amino acids and short peptides as cofactors gain peptidyl transferase activity, and gradually this mechanism evolved into the translation system. An alternative hypothesis based on a simplified computational model of polar and nonpolar monomers posits that at the earliest stages of protein evolution, small random peptides formed foldimers, which had the capacity to interact and elongate by self-catalyzing peptide bond formation. Okay, I want to see if this is, Greek. for me. But I want to see if I'm boiling down their scenarios 1 and 2, and then maybe you can unpack it a little bit for me.
Mhm.
So scenario 1 seems to be the RNA world hypothesis.
Yes.
And then scenario where it would be like a coding situation where it's coming about by code. Then scenario number 2 seems to be the proteins evolved without a code, but then I guess somehow later got into the code. I don't know. Can you explain what are they proposing as these scenarios?
Yeah, it's a little challenging to explain because they're so speculative, and so there's so little meat there that to explain it, you end up representing evolution, which is difficult to represent because there's no detail. But there are some things to say about the RNA world. This was a discovery that came 50 years ago or so, that RNA molecules. So when you make a copy of the DNA, you get something. What is that copy? It's RNA. Similar, but it's slightly different. So we call it RNA. RNA. So that's a gene product. RNA can be used to make a protein. So it's going through the genetic code to make these amino acids. Or it can go off and do things in its own right. So not all genes are translated into proteins. A lot of them go off and do something as an RNA. So you have these proteins going around the cell doing things. You also have RNAs going around doing things. Sometimes the RNAs and the proteins get together and work together in a machine. So what was thought years ago, initially, when we first started to discover these things, was that proteins are enzyme. They perform the enzyme function of speeding up reactions and doing things. And RNAs don't do that. But then it was discovered that there's an RNA that does, the RNAs can do things like proteins. And that kind of opened up the specter of, maybe there was a pre-protein world. This is evolutionary speculation. Maybe there was a pre-protein world and where it wasn't the genetic code, and the only gene products were RNA. They didn't have proteins, and these RNAs went around doing things. So you have cells working with only RNAs coming off of the DNA double helix and going around doing things and having mutations that are selected and so forth. So you get rid of proteins and you get rid of the genetic code problem. And instead, you just simply have mutations happening in the genome that are directly affecting the gene product, and you have evolution happening. And then, at some later stage, there was a flip, and proteins and the genetic code were introduced. It is so speculative, it's insane. But it's worse than that. The RNA, by the way, the hypothesis is called the RNA world. So there was an RNA world before proteins. That RNA world hypothesis has been argued against and falsified over and over and over and over again, and it keeps on popping back up. And I used to blog about this back when I was doing my written blog. Every time there would be an RNA, devastating arguments against the RNA world. I mean, even evolutionists were making these arguments. This isn't working. And then it would pop back up. And I counted, half a dozen times or more where this happened. So it just keeps on coming back because it's so attractive. And so they're mentioning it in this paper, but they're mentioning it softly because Koonin knows that, there's all these problems with it. But it's attractive to them because it's a way to maybe get around this genetic code problem. Maybe they didn't have it, or maybe there was a genetic code, but it didn't use proteins. But as I said earlier, it's never been observed. It's been hypothesized about. The closest thing you observe is that, yes, some RNAs have enzymatic function. Okay, great. That's wonderful. We're close to having a genetic code that is free of proteins. So it's so highly speculative. It's one of those things that's, hardly gains them a lot, but they're mentioning it. The second one is even more speculative, and I haven't really looked into that one, but it's because it's just evolution is just wild, just idly speculating about things that are very non-empirical. But they're trying to come up with ways that you could have proteins evolving that are shorter and smaller. I think that's what this is getting at, shorter and smaller. So yeah, we need hundreds of amino acids, even thousands of amino acids, proteins to evolve, but maybe they started out smaller and shorter and they folded up. So what they call them fold-ons or something like that. So foldicons or some phrase. And those were a stepping stone toward larger proteins. All they're doing there is kind of alluding to ideas that are floating around in the literature, in the evolution literature, that they can't really pursue very much in the paper because they're so speculative. They're simply relying on them as ways to cover over the problems with their assumptions. Oh yeah, people have done work.
Evolution fantasy land.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, you reminded me about something interesting that I noticed in the paper too, because it says duplications seem to be essential for the growth of evolving proteins, given that in a broad variety of organisms, the rate of deletions is higher than the rate of insertions. Under this deletion bias, proteins would shrink with time, contradicting the fact that, at least in many evolutionary lineages, protein complexity generally increases in the course of evolution. So basically, they need to get very large proteins, but what they're seeing is that actually the tendency would be for deletion, right?
Hilarious. Yeah, I missed that part. I don't remember that passage. That's funny. Yeah, you get this stuff all the time in the literature. And I mean, to a certain extent, I always want to give them acknowledge that it's a very difficult problem. I wouldn't mind it if somebody said, look, I think this is a kind of a crazy idea, but I want to pursue it. Okay, fine. But what we have is the theological mandating, such it's a fact, it is a truism, it gets theory protectionism, and all the social aspects that you mentioned. That's the problem. It's not, I don't have a problem if somebody wants to pursue ideas about evolution. They want to try, and as long as we're honest about the science and not introducing theology and not having religion drive our thinking here. And of course, we've talked about how evolution is so influential outside of science. So that this is where the real damage comes, where not only is it corrupting science, but it has corrupted our culture more broadly. It's corrupted other academic disciplines, history, sociology, psychology, on and on and on. So it's a very damaging idea that. And again, I say it didn't start with Darwin. You can trace it back to the Epicureans. This is a human project. I think it's gone on since there were humans walking this earth.
Yeah, and there's a couple of comments I want to give you a chance to respond to, and I'll respond to this one as well. But Hamobu, I guess, says that the whole argument is we don't know how evolution could have done this, therefore evolution didn't happen. Well, we have to decide, there has to be, for us to believe in evolution, there should be reasons to believe in it, right? So that's the problem I'm having is, why should we start with the assumption that evolution is true? Don't we need to actually look at scientific observations? Do you want to say anything about this, Dr. Hunter?
Yeah, so this is another classic rebuttal. Absolutely, you get this all the time. It falls in the category of a straw man argument of misrepresenting what you said. So I didn't say evolution didn't happen. And I didn't say we don't know how evolution could have done it. It's that evolution is religiously driven. It has made dozens of fundamental predictions that turned out to be false. So it has a long, long history of false predictions. It is relying on teleology and religious assumptions in the science, not just to mandate the theory is true, but it's actually in the science as well. The science tells us that there are enormous empirical problems with the idea, with the claim that the entire biosphere arose by chance. That is a low probability proposition. Is it false? Did it not happen? Well, that's another question. I don't know about that. It could have happened. Maybe there's a multiverse. Maybe we just got lucky. But that's not the claim. The claim is it's a fact. It is true. It is true. So you can't say that it is a fact, and then when someone demonstrates that it is not a fact, you can't then say, "Oh, okay, well, we did." All you're saying is we don't know how evolution could have done it, therefore evolution didn't happen. No, evolutionists are the ones making the claim. The claim is demonstrably false. It is demonstrably propped up by theology. We need to know that. That's it.
Now, question from the same person. Really? Has nothing changed since Darwin? No horizontal gene transfer, no viruses embedding themselves into DNA. There could be many other mechanisms that we don't know about. It's not all mutation.
So, of course, enormous things have happened since Darwin. He knew only a tiny, tiny fraction of what we now know in biology. That the additional knowledge we have gained has not helped the story. It has hurt the story over and over and over again. Not only have predictions turned out to be false, but the probabilities, the problems which Darwin only had a vague knowledge of have become worse, not better. So you can throw out terms horizontal gene transfer. That doesn't help. Now, as to your assertion about, well, it's not all mutation. No, of course not. There are many different mechanisms, dozens, hundreds of mechanisms that evolutionists appeal to. However, it is true that those had to arise somehow. And so when an evolutionist appeals to a higher order mechanism like epigenetics or horizontal gene transfer, lateral gene transfer, or whatever, those, according to evolutionary theory, must have been formed by what? Mutations. Or if they were formed by some other mechanism, that mechanism was formed by mutations. So it's going to come back to some low-level sorts of biological variation, usually that are mutations. If they come up with something else, fine. But what they have to have is unguided biological variation. So yeah, it's this is another common argument for evolutionists to appeal to higher order changes. Oh, horizontal gene transfer did it. Epigenetics did it. Well, where'd that come from? So yeah, it's mutations, and I can show you. I've written, I have blogs on this where evolutionists will admit that yeah, that had to have evolved. So why would epigenetics evolve? Because if they evolve, if first of all, epigenetics is profoundly complex. So it's not, the probability of that evolving is low. But if you did somehow luckily evolve these epigenetic mechanisms, what do they provide you? They provide you with the ability to adapt quickly and intelligently to an environmental shift. Well, why would that be preserved? Why, if it did luckily evolve, it's not going to do any good. It doesn't add fitness. It only adds fitness when you have that environmental shift. That's going to happen sometime in the distant future. According to evolutionary theory, things don't get preserved if they aren't helping right now. Things don't get selected by natural selection unless it's improving fitness now, not a million years from now. So epigenetics defies evolution, period. It's way too complex to have arisen, but then it wouldn't be selected for. So you got to be very careful in understanding the claims being made by evolutionists.
Sal asks, can Dr. Hunter comment on making of folds for multimeric proteins or proteins like in a complex homohexameric helicase, homotetrameric potassium ion channels?
Well, so yeah, hey, thanks you, Sal. Great question. And this is getting at the quaternary structure. So proteins usually work with other proteins in a protein machine. And so when proteins work together, they need to have binding between them. So, the exterior of one protein and the exterior of the other is going to bind together. Hemoglobin is another example. 4 globins that work together. That binding interface has to be very carefully tuned, and Michael Behe has written a lot on that and shown that the evolution just of that binding interface defies random mutation. So, yeah, this is another big problem. Now, this Koonin paper does actually briefly address that. And they did some experiments along those lines to show that not only could they evolve proteins, no problem, but they could also evolve a protein that would bind with another protein. So that they can evolve the binding surface to some extent. Well, that assumes the pre-existence of another protein, which we talked about earlier, right? So you're talking about the evolution of proteins. You need another protein. I don't think it was. I think they were falling back on the AI tool. And again, I don't think this was a legitimate representation of evolutionary theory. But yeah, I think what Sal's bringing up there is another big problem of not only is evolving a protein a huge problem, but as you said, Rebecca, it has to work in a larger environment. There has to be other entities, other moieties that it works with. And one of those is other proteins that they bind up together in a protein machine, copying the DNA. The RNA polymerase is this huge protein machine that slides along the DNA, opens it up, and makes the copy. Well, that's got tons of proteins in that machine that are working together. That's a huge problem of just, even if you have evolved a protein, how are you going to get these machines to work? How are you going to get them to work in these machines?
Now, whoops, that's not their comment. Sorry, that one just came up. But Solara Knight says Galapagos Islands proves evolution beyond a shadow of a doubt. And this is going to be the last question I'm taking. We'll close it down. So thank you all for your questions.
It sounds sarcastic. Sometimes with evolutionists, you can't tell, is this person having fun because this is so outrageous? It's such a easily falsified claim. That's like a joke that we would make to each other. Like, yeah, that proves it. That's a joke that we would make. How in the world do the Galapagos Islands prove? Well, Darwin went. Let's just tell the story. He went on this worldwide tour. Fantastic, great experience. He had a wonderful experience. He learned a lot, saw a lot. It was great. Collected samples, made a lot of mistakes. Sure, fine, but still, I give him a lot of kudos for that. One of the stops was the Galapagos Islands. He meets with the governor there, the British, because the British had governors everywhere. They controlled everything, and has dinner with this guy, and they discuss the species in these different islands. And one of the things that Darwin kind of realizes is the differences between the different islands, and the tortoises and the mockingbirds and the finches. It's like they're different on the different islands. There's these minor nuances, these variations. The governor there said I think it was looking at the turtles, I think it was, or one of the animals, he could tell which island it came from just by looking at it, because there were these differences. So he had become acquainted with it to that extent. Something like that. I may be misrepresenting, I may be misremembering it, but point is, Darwin finds out that there are these differences. Now, the idea that God would create species independently was becoming increasingly rejected over those centuries leading up to Darwin, because it would require a God that gets down in the details of the world. The Epicureans had argued against this. Anglicans were arguing against it. Ralph Cudworth, John Ray, Christians, John Ray was the father, considered by many to be the father of British natural theology, which is the argument for design. It was kind of the intelligent design of those times in the 18th century and first half of the 19th century. So these guys are, have high credentials, right? These guys are heroes of the faith, but they were arguing that God would not get involved in the world. So these are not evolutionists. These are not atheists. They're arguing God would not get involved in the world. He wouldn't get down in the muck. We're discovering all these insects, all this muck. God wouldn't get down into that world. This is the infradignitatum argument. And so this is what Darwin had inherited. And by the time Darwin's day comes around, it's just kind of a given. So when he goes to these islands and he finds different variants, or even maybe species, he's not sure. Is this like a variant? Are these turtles, finches, mockingbirds, are they different variants of one species? They might actually be different species. And he realizes, God would not have done that. This is where we're way down in the details. God doesn't muck it up. Some island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, God coming down here and like making different species on different, of course not. Of course they arose naturalistically. Of course they evolved. So it became a powerful argument, a theologically laden argument for evolution. Now, that's one argument that came out of the Galapagos. But it's after Darwin, of course, the theology was dropped, and it was just like, well, there's these different, variants, these different species, so they must have evolved, with no evidence for that. Now, another argument is the finches, the famous finches, that, these researchers went there and the husband and wife team and spent years there documenting the finches, and they showed that the beaks of these finches changes over time. Well, that's evolution. Well, that's not evolution. Changing the beak sizes and shapes is not evolution. Evolution is the entire biosphere evolved by chance. That's evolution. The changing of beaks through different climate changes, dry season, there was a drought and so forth. That's adaptation. And by the way, it was adaptation not by random mutation and natural selection. So that's not evolution. It was by pre-existing variants in the population coming and going, and by epigenetics, which is a problem for evolution. Epigenetics is not evidence of evolution. It is a problem for evolution. It defies evolution. In fact, evolutionists opposed epigenetics for practically a century. Anything smelling like epigenetics, anything Lamarckian, they scathingly attacked and argued against. And if you pursued that, your career was toast. You were excluded. So they were scathingly attacking that, until the point came a few years ago where you finally had to admit that epigenetics is real. You could no longer be in denial of epigenetics. So there's good evidence that these finches, the changes in the finches were due to epigenetic changes, which evolutionists opposed until they could no longer oppose. Now they've turned around and said, oh, well, that's actually just evolution. So they opposed it for a century and blackballed people. And now it's like, oh, yeah, well, that's just evolution. Well, no, it isn't evolution. Evolutionary theory does not explain how epigenetics arose. So this casual, facile, naive claims of, oh, well, the Galapagos Islands proves evolution. It's either sarcasm from somebody who's just having fun, and they realize how stupid the argument is, or they're actually an evolutionist who is naive and is not acquainted with the actual evidence and of the Galapagos Islands data.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have become convinced that small changes that are part of a natural variation that exists genetically for organisms, they've been convinced because they've been told over and over again that small changes can lead up to these dynamic, these huge changes in organisms if there's enough time. And so a lot of people have bought into that. So I think, people look at, okay, the finch beaks. See, just in this short time, you get different size of finch beaks. And therefore, if you have a long time, you can get a finch turning into something else.
Yeah. And so that kind of derives from, there's this old thought of a static world. So either the world is completely static, nothing ever changes, or else evolution is true. So any change that we discover anywhere is proof or strong evidence for evolution, because it's not static. So it's using a straw man or a null hypothesis that's very two-dimensional cardboard null hypothesis of, it's either a static world or evolution is true. You can't tolerate any level of adaptation, of physiological change, intelligent adaptation by species. Oh, evolution must be true. It's not, because it reveals how the species evolved. It reveals that the straw man is false. So it's a anti-intellectual approach to the science, unfortunately. Yeah. By the way, there is a movie that was made about 20 years ago by some Australians, and about Darwin. I think it was, I can't remember the name. So Darwin, the man who shook the world, or something like that. It's a good movie, actually. And they went to the Galapagos Islands and they interviewed an evolutionist researcher there, and he admitted that the finch stuff is a challenge for us. It's not. What it's showing is it's showing rapid adaptation, which is not what our theory proposes. So yeah, we're struggling with this. So that was an honest evolutionist speaking on camera, and it's in this movie. So this listener here who's claiming the Galapagos Islands proves this is really propaganda and brainwashing. It's not a honest, genuine reckoning with the evidence, which is what science is about. And so this isn't science. This is dogma. This is theory protectionism and dogma. As a scientist, like Mr. Nelson taught us in 7th grade, you need to be skeptical. You need to be interested in problems. You need to be, oh, really? There's a problem? Tell me more. Let me learn about this. Not throwing up barriers and protectionism. That's not science. That's dogma. Unfortunately, that's what you get in evolutionary theory.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Hunter. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Rebecca. I really had fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.